Okay, so welcome back to the deep dive. We've got a lot to cover today. Some pretty major policy proposals that, have the potential to really shake things up, particularly for families and their kids, education, finances, the whole nine yards. We're diving deep, as always, into some of former President Trump's recent proposals.
Right, focusing on education, homeschooling, and taxes. And it's fascinating how those three areas are all kind of intertwined. They get to the heart of how families make decisions about their kids' education, manage their money.
Yeah, and it's all connected to economic policy and, all these big picture issues. So we're going to break it all down for you today. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, just to give you a quick overview of what we're talking about here. We're looking at tax breaks for families who choose homeschooling. The possibility of homeschoolers being able to participate in extracurricular activities at public schools. Adjustments to something called SALT deductions, which we'll explain in a minute. The elimination of taxes on tips, and even tax credits for people who are caregivers.
A lot on the table.
There's a lot to unpack here. So let's dive right in. Let's start with education and homeschooling, because this is probably one of the most attention-grabbing proposals.
Definitely.
This idea of providing tax breaks for families who decide to homeschool their kids, it's essentially, putting money back in your pocket if you choose to educate your children at home.
Exactly. And the proposal suggests giving families a potential $10,000 per child every year, tax-free.
Wow.
To cover the costs of homeschooling. And that could be a significant game changer for families who, maybe have thought about homeschooling before, but just couldn't swing it financially.
Yeah, absolutely. Homeschooling has become increasingly popular in recent years. We've seen that trend. But the cost is definitely a barrier for a lot of families. So this kind of financial support could really, tip the scales for some, make it a more viable option.
It could, for sure. And it raises a bunch of other questions, too, right? I mean, what role should the government play in supporting different educational paths?
Right.
Should they be giving money to families who choose homeschooling? Should they be focusing more on public schools? And how might this impact the existing public school system?
Yeah.
I mean, these are all things that we need to think about.
Absolutely. Big questions, big implications. And it gets even more interesting when you start to think about the potential for homeschoolers to participate in extracurricular activities at public schools.
Right.
So imagine your child's homeschooled, but they want to, join the school soccer team or be in the drama club.
Right.
This proposal is aiming to make that possible by, guaranteeing them equal access to those activities.
Yeah. It's an intriguing idea, right? I mean, it sounds great on the surface, but the logistics of it could be really tricky. I mean, how do you actually integrate homeschoolers into these school-based activities in a practical way? How do you ensure fairness when it comes to, tryouts for a team or competition, especially in sports? Do homeschoolers have to meet the same academic requirements as public school students? How do you balance the needs of homeschooling families with the needs of the schools themselves?
Yeah.
There are a lot of potential challenges there.
Definitely a lot to consider.
Yeah.
And makes you think about, how would this actually play out in your own community?
Yeah.
Especially if you've got kids in school or you're involved in, local programs and activities.
Absolutely. And, these potential changes to the educational landscape, they're kind of tied into the proposed tax changes, right?
Yeah.
Because those could also have a big impact on families' ability to actually make those choices about, homeschooling, public school, all of that.
Right. Absolutely. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about those tax proposals because, as we said, these could affect everyone's bottom line. One of the most significant proposals is the pledge to fully restore something called the SALT deduction. And I know a lot of people are probably like, what the heck is SALT? SALT stands for state and local taxes.
Right.
Right now, there's a $10,000 cap on how much you can deduct from your federal taxes.
Right.
Which has been a big point of contention, especially for homeowners in states with high taxes. So think about it. If you're a homeowner, especially in a place with high property taxes, getting rid of that cap could save you a lot of money.
It could, yeah. But there are definitely arguments on both sides of this issue.
Oh, for sure.
Some people argue that restoring the full SALT deduction would mostly benefit wealthy homeowners, people who are already doing pretty well.
Right.
While others say that it's really important for fairness and that it encourages people to buy homes.
Right.
So it's not a simple issue. It's worth thinking about all the potential economic and political consequences.
Right. A lot of layers there. And then there's the proposal to get rid of taxes on tips, which, if you think about it, could have a big impact on people who work in restaurants, bars, hotels, any kind of service industry.
Absolutely. I mean, it could mean a lot more money in their pockets at the end of the day. But it also raises some questions, right?
Right.
I mean, could this lead to some restaurants raising their prices or maybe, adjusting wages to compensate? It's complicated. The overall impact is hard to predict.
Yeah. And then there's the tax credit for caregivers, which, as our population ages and more people need help taking care of elderly parents or loved ones, this could be really significant.
It could be huge. I mean, the proposal would allow families to deduct a certain percentage of their caregiving expenses from their taxable income. So it would directly reduce their tax burden.
Right.
And that could provide some much needed relief for people who are already, stretched thin financially and emotionally.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's interesting because this kind of ties back into the homeschooling conversation, right?
It does. How so?
Well, I'm thinking, if you combine this tax credit for caregivers with the proposed homeschooling benefits, it could really change the game for homeschooling
Oh,
families.
yeah, I see what you mean.
Imagine like a scenario where a parent is able to stay home to care for an aging parent and also homeschool their children, and they're getting financial support for both of those things. I mean, that could open up a lot of possibilities for people who might not have even considered homeschooling before.
It could. And it also raises questions about, the role of women in society, because
Yeah.
let's face it, a lot of the time it's women who end up taking on these caregiving responsibilities.
Mhm.
So would this, reinforce traditional gender roles, or could it actually empower women to make different choices about their work and family lives?
Yeah.
Really interesting stuff to think about.
Absolutely. A lot of food for thought there. And I think, what's so fascinating about all of these proposals is that they really have the potential to, reshape not just education and family finances, but like broader social trends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's all about thinking critically and, considering the potential ripple effects. What aspects of these proposals really resonate with you?
Right.
What further questions do they raise for you? I mean, we've just scratched the surface here today.
Exactly. And I think a final thought to leave you with is, as we head into this next election cycle, how might these proposals influence the political landscape?
Right.
How might they shape the conversations we're having about education, family, economic policy? These are all questions worth pondering as we move forward. So, yeah, a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.